Wei and I'm going to do my best to stay near the microphone, but I tend to wander a little bit when I talk, so please feel free to remind me if you can't hear me what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I want to thank Stephen and Wei and everybody with the Historic Society for inviting me down here today, because going through the fabulous 40s in Sacramento on an early Sunday morning when the weather is lovely is incredible. It really is. I live up in Auburn, and I prefer Auburn. That's as close as I want to live to Sacramento. But coming into this part of town is always a real joy on such a beautiful day. As Stephen mentioned, I used to be at the California State Railroad Museum. I was the director of exhibits and public programs, and I did a few other things there for a while. But before that, I was with the U.S. Forest Service, and for 13 years, I was the interpretive program manager for Tahoe National Forest, and I specialized in interpreting transportation over the Sierra. So that's how I got familiar with a lot of this. And since I've retired from state parks, I've been lucky enough to do some work with not only the UCRFA, but also today I'm a historian and consultant with the 1882 Foundation. And I'll talk about some of the work that we've done at this site during the talk. But I've been lucky enough with them to go as far east as Washington, D.C., and into Colorado, and into several states to talk about this really, really important history. And although I talk a lot about Chinese, I want to emphasize that since I'm not Chinese, I don't speak on behalf of anyone who's Chinese. I talk about things, and I am not. I think I'm correct in what I'm going to say today, but if I'm in error, please correct me. And Chuck does all the time, so I'm grateful for that. We recently had a success in December of the National Park Service and Secretary of Interior declaring the railroad camps up there used by the workers who built the tunnel complex designated as a National Historic Landmark. And it's called Summit Camp. It's called Chinese Camp, I believe. And in August, we're going to have a dedication ceremony on that we're still working out the details on. But it really is an important event in the history of America that just happens to involve thousands of Chinese people. But for us, it all begins in January of 1848 when James Marshall discovered that lump of gold at Sutter's Mill. You might have heard of that. It changed California. And I happen to have found a photo of the original nugget. This is the nugget that now sits at the National Archives. That was the nugget that that Marshall found that Sutter pounded down and treated with acid to determine it was gold. It was sent to President Tyler, and that's changed California and the world forever. And among other things, it really affected Chinese, because in mainland China during this time, there was a terrible conflict called the Taiping Rebellion that went on from 1850 to 1864. 20 million people died in the Taiping conflict. And in case you don't know the numbers like I do, because you don't look them up like I do, in our American Civil War, there was 630,000 casualties in the 4 years. This was the most horrible event in our national history here in the United States. But compare that to 20 million people perishing in the Taiping conflict. So hundreds of thousands of Chinese fled their country, going around the Pacific Rim looking for places that were safe and places they could work and earn money to send back to help keep their families alive. Because even with all of this going on, there was also persistent droughts in the Pearl River Delta, and crops were failing and people were starving regardless of what was going on. And then just to make it dumber, in the middle of all this, the French and the British came in and invaded parts of China in the Second Opium War, because China had come to an agreement with these countries in the 1840s to prohibit the import of opium poppies. Opium was not a Chinese product that anyone favored, and they prohibited it. But then during all of this conflict, the capitalists said, hey, we can make some money. So the French and British invaded again and reintroduced opium and just added to all of this horrible stuff. Meantime, back in California, there is the gold rush going on. And since the Mother Lode was a place where there were only a few Native American tribes, mostly the Nisenan group in this area, this was open land with no cultural norms, which meant no prejudices and no hatreds and no superiority for everything. So Chinese and Italians and Americans and everybody worked openly. This is a very famous photo, but it's from the town where I live in now, Auburn, showing Chinese in Auburn Ravine, where gold was first discovered, mining with white miners, and that was very, very common. Here's another thing from Harper's Weekly, showing a Chinese mining camp. It was just part of the thing. And the reason that the Chinese were so prominent was because of the Taiping Rebellion, but the numbers are incredibly high. Now this is a graph from the census that was done in 1852 in California. And 1/3 of the residents of Auburn are Chinese. 1/3. It's incredible. And I've since gone down to Sonora and Angels Camp and Murphy's, and the population proportions during that time is very similar. So about 1/3 of all the early gold rush miners were Chinese, and their impact was really obvious and really felt. But by the mid-1850s, because all humans are a very flawed species, we began hating one another. And Chinese dress funny, and they eat weird foods, and you can't understand a thing they say. And they even write in this weird way. Not only is it crazy looking calligraphy, but it goes from right to left, and it goes from down to up, I think. Up to down, thank you. And so people started getting suspicious, and because Caucasians are generally taller and beefier, and we are louder, and we still outnumber the Chinese as much as they are, we began to impose discriminatory measures. Now this is a cartoon from Harper's Weekly, done by Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was a satirical cartoonist. He was on the side of the Chinese, and so he does these things that are kind of satirical. And if you look on the hat band of the miner, right there, that hat band is the shape of California, so that represents all of California. And then if you look on the plinth of the statue, it says, "Courts of Justice closed to Chinese, extra taxes to Yellowjack." And the miner is doing the worst possible thing you can do to a Chinese person, attempting to cut off his queue, which is incredibly disrespectful. But Nast, as a satirist, was in the minority, unfortunately, and you have increasing discrimination. So you end up having mass meetings. The handbill on the left is from a event that was done in Nevada City in 1886 by C.F. McGlashan, who was a very well-respected figure in Truckee and throughout much of the state of California. He was the leading proponent of getting rid of the Chinese. And he traveled the West giving speeches and speeches. He also owned a newspaper where he had a huge editorial voice called the Truckee Republican. He was a state senator for a while. He was a judge. He was the superintendent of schools in the Truckee area. And he was a brilliant communicator. So unfortunately, he had a lot of influence in that. Contrast that with another satirical cartoon with the jackass braying, "The Chinese must go," and all of these horrible things behind it. So there starts to be foreign miners' taxes. There starts to be mysterious fires in Chinese areas that are all blamed on poor stovepipes, not the arsonists who probably set them in the middle of the night. And the Chinese are shifted in many places. But in the meantime, building the Central Pacific, which began in 1865, or 1864 rather, there's trouble because the first few miles through Sacramento here on through to Roseville, it's just flat. You know that, we've all driven up Interstate 80, it's beautifully flat. But then you get just a little beyond Rockland, up in the Penryn area, you have to start digging uphill. This is hard work. And the white people were not satisfied with the lousy payment that the Central Pacific was offering. Plus, what's going on from 1860 to 1865 in much of the United States? The Civil War. And over 30,000 Californians enlisted in the California battalions and went back east to help preserve the Union in the Civil War. So there was kind of a white labor shortage. But even worse than that, just east of us in Nevada, there's the Comstock Lode. For people my age, we know that this is what made Ben Cartwright rich and funded the creation of the Ponderosa. But the Comstock lode was a huge silver strike, the largest one in world history at the time. And they paid good wages to have people go down into hot tunnels and dig out that ore. And so certain white people would actually sign on to the railroad, and they would ride to the end of the track, work for a couple days, and say, hey, thanks, see ya, and just continue eastward into the Comstock lode. So there was a huge labor shortage. And in frustration, the railroad turned to some labor brokers in Auburn, because Newcastle is right next to Auburn, and Chinese had already worked as laborers in Auburn. There was still a relatively large population, and they had built the Dutch Flat Donner Lake Wagon Route, which is a toll route, and that was funded or managed by Charlie Crocker, one of the railroad owners. So he hired more of them, and he put them to work at a place that's about a mile from where I live today, called Bloomer Cut. This is a deep trench that had to be dug through this trench, and this was the first place on the railroad where explosives had to be used to dislodge the substrate. And the Chinese were first hired in I've seen different numbers of either 11, 14, or 20, and their job was to go in after the blast before the smoke had cleared, fill carts with the muck in it, and pull the carts out and dump the muck to the side. But they were very, very good at it, and the white people that they worked with quickly grew to depend on them. And the owners of the railroad, initially very suspicious, quickly understood that these people were working very hard. And one reason was employment opportunities by this time, because of all the prejudice, were very limited for Chinese. And Chinese were horribly underemployed. So quickly the railroad went out and they hired labor brokers that are called tongs, and they said, I need workers. And the tongs went all over California getting every Chinese person they could possibly get. And then they quickly ran out of labor, so they started even getting laborers coming in from China. In the meantime, Bloomer Cut keeps getting cut. This is one of these great photos. And there's a plaque near Bloomer Cut that I take people to when I take them up there that says that this is the 8th wonder of the world. And it was at the time. Nobody had seen anything like this. And by the way, the plaque misspells the word 8. So my tip to you is always proofread things if you're going to cast them in bronze. But Bloomer Cut is still in use today. This is what it looks like today versus what it looked like 158 years ago. And today it's mostly westbound traffic on the railroad, and when we take the California Zephyr west, most of the time we go through Bloomer Cut. And you couldn't build this today if you were a railroader. You would have to make it wider and slope the sides back to prevent erosion. But this is so structurally stable that it has an exemption from that rule, but it is still in use today. By the way, if you do ever go up there, it's easy to find on the internet, or if you go to my house and turn left. If you do go there, please don't ever go into the trench. The trains that are coming westbound are basically coasting. You can't hear them. If you're in there when a train comes through, you might not survive. And I want to be very careful never to tell anybody to go on active railroad tracks, but particularly in the cut. So by 1865, Chinese labor predominated. Now this is a statue at the Upper Depot in Auburn on Lincoln Way. It's called the Chinese Coolie, and it was cast in the 1970s and moved to this spot in the 1980s, and it's one of the more respectful statues that I just love there. Sorry about that. But if you look on the graph on the left, you'll look at the numbers. In January 1864, there were 23 people documented, 23 Chinese. But go down to 1866 and 1865, you start seeing thousands of Chinese. And these are just the numbers that have been documented from existing records. They're probably a little low versus the total number, because the records are over 150 years old. They're hard to find. But it just becomes huge. And these were not total workers. These were workers hired in those months. It's astounding. Quickly, they became 85 to 90% of the workforce on the Central Pacific. And so many of them came over that it created a lot of business for a company called the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which ran originally just mail and a little bit of freight across the Pacific, but soon became a big passenger carrier. And they had a big wharf in the San Francisco Bay, and then people and supplies would be transshipped on smaller sloops up the Sacramento River and docked at the docks in what is today Old Sacramento. But getting past Cape Horn, we need more and more labor. We're doing a lot of things. It's more difficult as we go up the hill. The next thing is Cape Horn, which is really significant. And if you're not familiar with Cape Horn, as you're going up Interstate 80 through Colfax, you leave Colfax and go under a big iron railroad trestle. Off to the right as you're headed up the hill would be Cape Horn. And this is a viewpoint that you can get onto on Highway 174. Now, Cape Horn is the subject of a lot of controversy for some people, and I'm going to call that mythology, and here's why. You can see the railroad cut there, and way down deep below, over 1,300 feet below, is the North Fork of the American River. It is an incredible view, but a difficult place to get to up there. But the mythology is that the Chinese who built that hung from baskets down a vertical granite cliff and chopped away the side, and some of them were blown up in explosions when they set fuses that were too short and couldn't climb up the ropes. There's no first-hand accounts that tell you any of that stuff. But there's nothing really that describes that in great detail, but the scholars who have studied it, including scholars at Stanford University, including Professor Gordon Chang, who headed up an entire project for 10 years to do this, have decided that probably didn't happen. But the mythology persists. In fact, here's a beautiful painting that is called Powder Monkey's Cape Horn, done by a Chinese artist, and I can't pronounce the name because I don't speak Chinese. But this is mythological. If you look again at Cape Horn, the reality is that it's not a vertical cliff. It's about 50 degrees, and it is steep, but it's about 50 degrees. In the photographs of the 19th century, the vegetation types look very similar to what it looks like today. And that means if you actually fell off the railroad bed, you'd roll into a bush. You wouldn't tumble thousands of feet down and die in the river. And it's not granite. It's schist, which you can dig with a shovel. So it's presumed, although there's still no first-hand accounts that really talk about this in detail, but I've seen, Chuck may have seen something that I haven't. But we believe that the Chinese followed a survey line and carved out a footpath with shovels and rock bars and things like that, and then just kept making it larger and larger and larger and larger. But it's not granite, and it probably did require black powder blasting once in a while, but it's not granite that you hung from vertical boson cliffs on. Yes?
So if it's so used that you could dig it with a shovel, how is the railroad that solid?
Because until you dig it, it's still pretty solid, in the same way that I don't fall into deep holes in my little orchard out back that I dug holes in previously. Schist is lots of small horizontal layers, and you can stack them so they're pretty stable. There is some harder rock out there. There's also volcanic rock out there, but it's pretty stable. But your point is good, because occasionally they've had to work and repair that track. And there's actually another track out there now that goes further back into the mountain and actually goes through a tunnel. But this was such an engineering wonder that for many years, whoops, I don't want to give away my secret yet. For many years, trains would stop so that passengers could get out and enjoy the view. And there's still a concrete platform out there where at one time I think there were bleachers built so you could get out and look at that. Well, remember, riding a train was amazing, because until railroads were invented in the 1830s, the only way you could travel faster than about 10 miles an hour was on a very fast horse for a short distance, or on a sailing ship. And getting on a train and going 35 miles an hour was like light speed for everybody. No one had ever gone that fast. And no one had ever seen these things in just a few days crossing the country. So it really, really was a revolution. Now in 1999, connected with the release of a book about the railroad, the Colfax Historic Society put up a monument here, and they perpetuated the myth. If you look at the text, it says, they were lowered over the face of Cape Horn promontory in wicker bosun's chairs to a point 1,332 feet above the canyon floor. 20 years later, after a lot more research and work done by Stanford and many other groups, blessedly, the Colfax Historic Society replaced them with what I consider to be a much more accurate retelling of that, and I'm very grateful to the Colfax people for doing that. When I used to manage the social media for the Railroad Museum, whenever we would mention Colfax or Cape Horn on our Facebook page, I would get pilloried by people going, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I might not, but I probably know more than they do. But I'm really grateful that sign is there. And if you go to a place called the Red Frog Bar, The monument is right next to that, and if you went and buy a beer, they always appreciate it, but you don't have to. It's still the next place up track that's kind of significant for Chinese history, at least to me, is Secret Town. And this is a famous photo that you may have seen, and some books put it in as a photo of the railroad being built. It's actually not. This is 1874, about 5 years after the railroad is completed. And what the Chinese are doing over here to the right of the trestle with those single axle carts is they're laboriously bringing in cartfuls of dirt to fill that in. They're burying the trestle. God bless you. They're burying the trestle. And why would you bury a trestle? Because trestles are rickety. And particularly wooden trestles and steam engines that emit sparks might not survive. And in the hot, dry summers that we have in the Sierra Nevada and in all of California, wooden structures need constantly to be maintained and tightened because the wood shrinks and the bolts need to be tightened. So they filled this in, and it is still in use today. Here's what Secret Town looks like today. And just to the right, behind that very heavy tree you see on the right side of the photo, is the westbound lanes of Interstate 80. And I've always wanted to dig a hole in there and see if I can find remains of the trestle, but I'm not going to do it. But the part that I'm most interested in, that I pay a lot of attention to, is Donner Pass. And this is the site of the Chinese Camp Landmark, and I'm going to show a real map of that. But the first thing I like to bring out is an air photo to show you what's what here. So my green laser doesn't work that well, but this sinuous line right here is Old Highway 40. Today it's called Donner Pass Road. This line right here is the railroad itself. And then if you look carefully in some of this area and some of this area, you can find some other routes. Those are old wagon routes and part of an old toll road that used to be there, and likely some things that may have been built for to facilitate railroad construction. So that's the general lay of the land. This is actually our national landmark. Within the 2 dashed line units is the national landmark. And the green tinted land is all public land. It's part of Tahoe National Forest. The gray stripe through the middle of it is Union Pacific ownership, and that's the railroad bed, because Union Pacific, when it was built as the Central Pacific, the land grants given to them in the Pacific Railroad Act gave them 200 or 250 feet, I think it's 200, Chuck, isn't it? Feet on either side of the center line of track. And that extends in a tunnel up to the surface of the land. So they own all of that, and it's been detracked since 1993, but it is still Union Pacific ownership, and they are wonderful people to work with who don't support what we're doing, but they're still very nice about this. So the National Landmark does not include any of their ownership at this point. Now you might have heard of Donner in another way. It snows up there. I lived for 13 winters 7 miles west of Donner Pass, and one February I had 14 feet of snow on the ground. It was not the best Valentine's Day in the world. It is one of the snowiest places on earth. And when Theodore Judah surveyed the Transcontinental Railroad route, he looked in winters that were remarkably light in snowfall. He was dead wrong. When the railroad reached that point and they began constructing it, they had some of the heaviest snowfalls ever recorded. And in fact, the first winter of 1865-66, they had to abandon work because of the snow, and they sent workers further east down the Truckee River Canyon to begin building roadbeds down toward Nevada. It is a long, long, cold winter, and a couple of years ago, in mid-May, I think, there was a railroad conference in Reno, and one of the field trips was to look at the Summit Tunnel, but it was buried, so we looked at the place where it would be if we could find it. But the snow eventually does melt, and it's a beautiful summer up there. Whoops, I went in the wrong direction. It is a beautiful summer up there. It's a beautiful summer up there today. It's probably 65 degrees up there right now, and probably very windy. But this is what the railroad bed looks like. That's the horizontal line through the photo. This thing right here is called Tunnel 7. It looks to me like a pickup truck. This is the east portal of Tunnel 6. This is an early 20th century road, but there used to be a highway there.
This is,
The printer.
Use your fingers.
yeah, okay. It works better on a reflective screen. Here's the railroad bed, here's tunnel 7, which looks to me like a pickup truck. Here's an avalanche wall leading into tunnel 8. The wall is there to keep avalanches from overtopping railroad equipment. This is an early 20th century road that was part of the Lincoln Highway that switchbacks down into here. This is today's Donner Pass Road. And this is the east exit of Tunnel 6. And Tunnel 6 is the most interesting thing up there for most people because that's the summit tunnel. So the railroad was designed and of course and managed by white people. James Strobridge was the chief engineer and yes. And I'm trying to think of the other guy's name because I thought about it in the shower this morning. I knew I'd forget it.
The surveyor is Lewis Clements.
Lewis Clements, yes. Yes. So these are on display at the Railroad Museum, or at least they used to be. I hope they still are. But the workforce was mostly Chinese, but the leadership was white engineers, and they followed almost all of Judah's original survey, and it was a brilliant survey because nobody really thought that a railroad could cross a 7,000-foot mountain range because you could only go 1.5% or sometimes 2% on a grade on a locomotive. And as I mentioned, snow gets very deep, and how deep it is even. What am I doing here? Yeah, sorry. This is snow that's probably 15 feet deep. It's as high as the smokestacks on these locomotives. But they shoveled and they did their best they could to keep the line open, and it led to a lot of closures and still leads to occasional closures today. During construction, after 1866, they kept working in the winter, and they did have accidents. So this is a newspaper clipping from the Marysville Times-Gazette that talks about an avalanche that overtopped a barracks that had many Chinese in it. And I won't read you the whole thing here, but they were found after 40 hours, buried in the snow for 40 hours, and there were over 50 Chinese and 39 of them perished. But then when they actually dug everyone out, they found that the death count was only 17. So the newspaper article says, oh, much better than 30. And they even quote a Chinese worker who was found buried under the snow. He was in bed and the roof of his shanty had been crushed down in such a way to confine him there without injury. When dug out, he got up and shook himself, exclaiming, "Oh, too much a hot." They don't name the man, but they go on further in the article to compare it in great detail to the story of a solitary white traveler who was killed by an avalanche the year before, and they name him and give great detail about all this other things. But this is kind of this passive-aggressive discrimination of there's 19 Chinese who died, there's over 50 who were trapped. They use kind of a jokey phrase to quote this person, but then something unrelated that happened the year before, they give you great detail about names and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's kind of the attitude that we had towards Chinese in those days. And it's in my mind, it's really concerning, but it was the norm for virtually everyone back in the 19th century. The most prominent thing that I think people recognize relating to Chinese, because it's well known, is China Wall. China Wall is a fill with this wall in front of it, and it spans a very deep and narrow and little creek that is kind of the headwaters of Donner Lake. And it's this beautiful thing. I have been there in all seasons of the year. I've been there in all times of day, including full moons, and I get mesmerized looking at it. And in my original presentation, I had like 20 slides just looking at these rocks. but I'll share just this one, because when you look at these rocks, they are all individually shaped by master masons to fit. And on this one in particular, you can see those 4 gouge marks down at the bottom. Those are called feather and wedge marks. And those are marks made by the man that shaped this rock to place it there. So when I go to that rock, I know that this person stared intently at this. And someone did on virtually every one of these rocks. It's just a thing, to me, of incredible beauty and grace. And it would still serve its purpose today if tracks were on it. Now, this is a rare photo that was never published. It was found when Southern Pacific closed out. It was found in their archives. And it shows construction of China Wall. So The wall is being built here. This is tunnel 7, this is tunnel 6. Over here, there are barracks and maybe offices and things. Sorry about that. And there's also a derrick right here that is used to lift these heavy 400 to 500 pound rocks and place them into place. There's a man and a horse and a single axle cart that was used to carry rocks. So that's a wonderful, wonderful image to me. And when we zoom into it a little bit, we can see a little bit more. The man is moving a little bit, so he's fuzzy, but here's the horse and cart. Here's the derrick. There's guy wires to help hold it straight, but the derrick was something used to move very, very heavy objects in those days. And if you look at the wall, it's not vertical, it's actually leaning back. And that's why, one reason why it's so stable. So here's what it actually looks like from the top. And you can see that it lays back at, I think, about 7 degrees. I haven't measured it in a while. And on this roadbed here were the tracks from 1867 to 1993. Yes, sir?
What powered the derrick?
A big crank with a lot of wheels.
Yeah, but I mean, what powered it?
A person. Yes. Yes. They may have used an animal to help power it, but I've seen other hand cranked ones where they use gears to reduce the thing. So it takes forever to do it. The Central Pacific Railroad, and I'm going to show you the one exception here in a minute, but the Central Pacific Railroad was afraid of using steam equipment. The Union Pacific did, but the Central Pacific refused to use it except in one specific instance. Other than that, it was all hand power. And here's the best photo I can find that shows China Wall in use. This is during World War II, so it's a Southern Pacific Cap 4 locomotive westbound, just coming out of Tunnel 8, headed towards Tunnel 7, and it's crossing China Wall. And I don't know if anybody here knows him, but the photographer was a man named Ken Yo. Did you know Ken? Yeah. Ken passed away just a few years ago. I met him in the last years of his life, but he was a rail fan from years ago, and when he was a teenager, he went up there and shot that photo. And you've already seen the next one here. One of the hugest threats that we face is the proliferation of graffiti. It wasn't really too bad until the COVID years, and for some reason, the past became a place where taggers started thinking, well, this is one place I can get out and take off my mask, and the tagging up there just exploded. And Ted, who's here today, can tell you with great passion that in his view, he feels that this is the equivalent of going into a cemetery and tagging gravestones. And he's got a very good point in that, because people died building this tunnel. And people came thousands of miles to an unknown and very strange and hostile land to build this tunnel and help make America great. And for people to just obscenely do this is incredibly disturbing. And one reason we want to offer more protection to it is to deal with these issues. But the tagging is really horrible to me personally, because there's nothing you can do. You can sandblast it and remove it, but when you do, you're removing the original patina that the builders left when they finished the tunnel. If you use chemicals, it does the same thing. It microscopically alters the surface of the rock. So this is, even if the paint is removed, it's irrevocably changed from what the builders have left. And to me, that's a horrible, horrible crime. But let's talk about some happier things for a little bit. As you walk around the sites, most people are focused on the tunnels and the roadbed. And so the site of our national landmark is actually in much better shape for an archaeological site. And as you walk around, sometimes you see little pieces of orange rust. And then sometimes you'll see flat areas. And another big piece of orange rust, this right here, is probably the remains of a bucket or a cask of some sort. And I don't know if you can see that, but that flat piece of ground there is vaguely rectangular. And when I talk to the archaeologists I know who are smarter than I am,
You'll come back to that.
Just remind me not to touch it. They'll tell you that this is a foundation because it makes a corner here. And this was actually a barracks. This was a place where Chinese people lived and talked and recovered after a hard day's work. And at part of this site, just out of the photo, there happens to be this thing. This hole here is actually a hearth that was used for cooking. And if you look very carefully around it, you can find remnants of iron cookware and pottery and things like that. So the archaeologists know with absolute certainty that this is a heart. Here's a more general view of the whole site there. And if you look at the photo in the upper corner, it's going to appear, if I do this right, there it is. This building shows in that photo as one of the ones near the left-hand side of the image. So we can trace these things pretty well. It's been very extensively studied, both in our landmark nomination and by Forest Service archaeologists and some archaeologists from some different universities. And it's not uncommon because people are focused on the railroad to find that this site is still very rich, to show us some evidence of the people who were there. And these are all things that I found on my walks. And I do take people up there, I do show them some of these things, but you never ever remove anything from a site. For one thing, it belongs to the people of the United States, and if you remove it, you've actually committed a felony. It's a violation of the Antiquities Act. But also, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you take a piece out of a puzzle, the puzzle is never complete. And we want to leave these pieces so that other people can have the experience and the delight of discovering things that were left behind over a century ago. And listening to the echoes in the pottery. What did they talk about as they had their rice? Who did they hear? And sometimes we will find amazing, amazing things. This has happened to me 3 times in the 30 years I've been going up there. I found Chinese coins. Now, the currency is no good in a railroad camp. But how many people carry a coin in their pocket? I used to carry a silver dollar that my grandfather had given me. And so this is a reminder of home. It's also used in camp for gambling and little trade and stuff like that. But Chinese currency wasn't of any use monetarily in these things. For one of the coins that I found, and I've done trips where we found 3, we photographed it and sent it to a numismatist who told us that these were from the 18th century, the early Qing dynasty, and they translated the denominations. And I wish I remember the details of that, but to me it's really spine-tingling to find something like this that you know was held in someone's hand and had actual emotional and monetary value to them. Well, let's get to the heart of the matter in the Summit Tunnel. This is a famous photo that many people have seen showing Summit Tunnel, and this is shot indoors. And as you know, film emulsions were very, very slow in those days, so it's likely that mirrors and artificial lights of some sort had to be used. And this was probably a multi-minute exposure. So one reason you don't see any workers in it is they would have been moving and were completely out of place. But it's a superb thing because it was viewed as impossible by many people to build. And at the time, it was one of the highest elevation tunnels in the world, and it was the longest tunnel built for the Central Pacific Railroad in an incredibly hostile environment. Horrible, long, deep snows, long, long winters, and very hot and dry summers, sometimes punctuated with thunderstorms. And since you're at the summit of the mountains, you could be struck by lightning at any day. But back to things, here's an Alfred Hart photo. It says East Portal of Summit Tunnel. It clearly ignores the man in the cart there, even though that's the subject of the photo, because they're just Chinese. There's no point in really mentioning that. I do have some things on the back table. This is a close-up of one of them. This is a rock drill. It's called a star drill because it has a 4-pointed head in it. And the one I have is probably 20th century, but these star drills were used in the 19th century. They were about 5 feet long, and two apprentices would hold the drill while the person that they trusted very, very much would take a sledgehammer and whack, and then you would rotate it a quarter turn, whack, and rotate it a quarter turn, and you would drill a hole sometimes 3.5 to 4 feet deep. How long do you think that would take? About 6 to 8 hours is what the records say. And then into that, in the early days of the tunnel, drilling 2.5-inch deep holes. The one I have is 1.5 inches in diameter. They would insert black powder, put in a sand plug, put in a fuse, light the fuse, run like crazy, and boom, and before the dust clears, clean it up. But the Summit Tunnel, one of its remarkable things about it was it became the first tunnel commercially using nitroglycerin to excavate that. And that's because nitro is 6 times more powerful per volume than black powder. And this granite at Donner is some of the hardest granite in the world. And the normal progress on the tunnel was 6 to 11 inches per day. So by moving to nitroglycerin, they could double their forward progress, because 1,659 feet at 6 inches a day takes you a long time. So these rock drills were very, very, very important. And I do have one back there that I'm happy to show you. This is what the bottom of one of the blast holes looked like a few years ago. You can still see the radial marks. There it is. You're just playing games with me now. You can still see the radial marks from the blast on that. And this is why the tunnel's integrity is so important. You see what the builders saw. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like today. Yeah, and I'm gratified to hear that expression of great disappointment, because this is not repairable. You can remove it, but it will never be as it was. I'm sorry about that. But here's a schematic of Tunnel 6. And I've got a wrong number on there. I say 1,654 feet. The correct length is 1,659 feet. It was the longest and highest tunnel on the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the longest in the world. The average progress was 8 to 12 inches today with black powder, and it took nearly 2 years to complete. Notice in the top there is a vertical line going down. That's the center shaft for the Summit Tunnel, because one of the ideas that the engineers had was, how can we work faster? How about if we drill a hole in the middle, and that way we can excavate from the inside out, so we have 4 faces to work on rather than 2. And that would double your progress. So they quickly, in the first fall, they drilled, or the first late summer and early fall, they drilled an 80-foot shaft. This is a photo that shows the shaft house, which is the barn is right here, so the shaft is right here. This is where the highway is today. Here's a pond that was here that was the water source for a steam boiler. This is the only place where steam equipment is used. And here's some ore cart tracks where they dumped waste out. So there's the ore cart, Chuck.
It's back.
It's teasing me, it just hates me. So here's what the center shaft looks like today. It has an iron cover on it to keep people from falling in, presumably, because it's an object of fascination. There's still waste rock around it. Those little sharp pieces of rock you see are probably waste rock that was blasted out when that was built. But one of the neat things about it was they mounted a vertical steam boiler. That's why they built the shaft house. The shaft house needed a wood supply, and they needed to house a steam boiler that they dragged up from an old locomotive in Sacramento. They put it on a freight wagon to Dutch Flat, and then they winched it on skids the rest of the way. And they mounted it vertically here to serve as a steam hoist to lift rock out and lower men and explosives in. And one of the really neat things about this is you can still see bolts where that boiler was mounted. 3 of the 4 bolts are still there today. And so this is an amazing, amazing place. It tells you so much. This is what the center shaft looks like from inside the tunnel. You really can't photograph this unless you have a BBC television crew and they have a lot of lights. Because we did a documentary and they shot that up for me. And yes?
What was the purpose of the vertical shaft? Just to ventilate the tunnel?
Well, in use it was a ventilation device because a lot of smoke builds up in there. But they drilled down so they could start excavating from the inside out.
Okay.
And that way they could work on 4 faces rather than 2. So, but think about this for a minute. They drill an 80-foot deep hole. The surveyors have planned this very carefully so they know right where the tunnel will be. Easy math, but incredible precision involved in that. And then they get to a calculated depth. And the white guy goes down there with some Chinese. He says, okay, boys, that way and that way. And when the tunnel was finished, they determined that the alignment was off by ½ an inch. Over 1,659 feet. That's a remarkable thing. The math is simple, but again, being that precise, oh my goodness.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
have you ever heard the expression, he doesn't have a Chinaman's chance in hell?
Yes, and I've heard that it's attributed to this project, but that may be, I don't know how true that is.
Okay, I'm just curious, because I've heard that in my youth.
It came up at one of the previous meetings we went to, and someone has attributed it to the railroad. But you can say anything you want. I wasn't there at the time. I'm old, but I'm not 160 years old. When the railroad was in use, the whole tunnel complex up there was a very high maintenance thing, and here's one reason why. Now, in the photo I'm going to show you, the rails have been removed for several years, but this is what builds up in the winter. And I've seen a video that shows Maintenance Away working on this in the winter. And every morning during winter season, they had to send someone up with a Maintenance Away crew and a special locomotive with what's called icebreakers on top. But they would have to get sometimes on top of the locomotive and chip things away, because if you're an engineer going through there at 30 miles an hour and you hit this, you will die. Yeah. And you'll ruin the train. So it leaks like crazy, and this is with that iron cover over it. But there's also icicles throughout the entire tunnel, even into sometimes early summer, because the rock is very porous. We think of granite as a big massive thing, but it's got thousands of fractures in it, and particularly since you blasted it. And I keep returning this, there's a lot of snow up there. These are two views about a month apart in 2023. This was the year we had the conference in Reno on the truck. But again, back to the Chinese. Obviously, a really obvious Chinese crew, but it's labeled laborers and rocks. And then this one, a very famous photo showing a Chinese tea bearer. He's got a shoulder mount with buckets of tea on either side, but it doesn't even mention him. It says heading of the west portal of Tunnel 8, or the east portal rather. But the Chinese did so much, and they did such quality and precision work. This is just a little bit west of the Summit Tunnel. This is a drain that's under a piece of road bed that is no longer used. But there are other drains throughout the thing that look like this. These are they're exactly what you see. They're huge blocks of granite that are just laid on top of each other, and they help a stream drain under the track so it doesn't wash out. That's beautiful but remarkable workmanship. But eventually they did get out of the Sierra. They got into flatter ground, faster building, but they're in the Nevada desert. So water has to be brought in, everything has to be brought in. It's 100 degrees, it gets down to probably 40 at night because it's the desert. And they're moving much more quickly, so rather than being in buildings and semi-permanent camps, they're in tents that are moving every couple of days. And then as they get into Utah, Leland Stanford has a bet with Thomas Durant about who can build more track in a day, and they have a contest, and the Central Pacific sets up a very elaborate procedure, and they lay 10 miles of track in a day. And today, even to this day, that record has not been broken. The Central Pacific cheated a little bit. They laid all the ties alongside, they laid all the rails alongside. All they really did was just run up and place the rails and ties in place. But they still beat Durant, who had built something like 8.5 miles a few days before. And the bet was for $10,000, and to the best of my knowledge, Durant welched on the bet. But the Union Pacific ended up buying this railroad, so the debt is null. Yes?
Yeah, I heard that the track had to be replaced because it was moving so fast.
In many places, track had to be really repaired and replaced rather quickly, and that was more true on the Union Pacific side because they were sloppier. When Congress had hearings and they had government inspectors look out, the Central Pacific side was always better built than the Union Pacific side. But it was done in haste. This was a race because the ultimate prize was thought to be coal deposits in Weber Canyon, which is a little bit east of Salt Lake City, north and east of Salt Lake City, and the Union Pacific got there first. But they were trying to outcompete each other because they got paid per mile of track also. And here in Utah, right after the 10-mile day, if you go out to Promontory National Monument, you see parallel track beds that were built because they wouldn't stop, they wouldn't agree. And finally President Grant forced the issue. But it turned out to be a point called Promontory Summit, and West and East met there on May 10th, 1869. And there's a national monument there today. And when the locomotives touched their pilots together, it changed our nation. in a way that is still much different than it used to be. And you've seen the famous photo that shows no Chinese at all in there, even though they were most of the workforce. But the National Park Service has done some in-depth analysis of this, and they believe that there are 2 Chinese in this highlighted spot. And if you look carefully, there's one idiot who's holding his hat in front of a Chinese person. And there's another Chinese person right over here who's blurry, who looks like to me like he's being pushed out of the way. So that's the famous photo that everybody knows, but there are actually photos that clearly show the Chinese workers. And the Chinese, yes, sir?
I continue to read, because I've read a lot on the railroad, and this is all very interesting, and I'm a docent at the Crocker Art Museum, so we're very interested with Charles and Edwin Bryant Crocker. And for a long time, I said promontory point, and a lovely gentleman from the Railroad Museum said, no, it's not the point.
That might have been me.
He said it's the summit, but I still find in books it says point.
Oh, yes, and you find all kinds of
Because
things.
you have to go down into the Salt Lake to get to the point.
That's right, it's about 30 miles south.
Yeah.
We did a conference in Salt Lake City last year, and that was one of the things we talked about in depth. But you know, whatever you call it,
Promontory at least.
but it really, if you look on the maps, the geographic feature is Promontory Summit. And it begins the ridge that comes down to Promontory Point, but it's a flat plain at the site. Anyway, there are actually Chinese. They were mentioned in the press. They were photographed in this and a couple of other photographs as ceremonially laying the last rail. They had that honor, and it was pointed out in press accounts at the time. But they were erased from a lot of our history just because they're white. But there are these weird anomalies. Now, this is a painting that's at the Railroad Museum. It's called The Last Spike by Thomas Hill. Leland Stanford had this commissioned in 1881, and for many years it hung in the state capitol. And it's an allegorical painting. Doesn't accurately represent things. There are people in the painting who were dead at the time, such as Theodore Judo. And there's just crowds that didn't exist there. But if you look carefully, there are Chinese that don't show in that famous photograph. They're there to the left of Stanford, and I've circled them here, and they are clearly subordinate to Governor Stanford, but they are there in the painting. And since Stanford's entire political career was really focused on being anti-Chinese, I think this is remarkable that he chose to have these painted in here. This painting had an interesting history because Stanford would look at it as it was being painted and he'd say, no, get rid of that guy and add this guy. And so the fact that he consciously wanted Chinese here, I think, says a lot for Stanford. And, you know, thank goodness we're past these days, but there used to be hypocrisy in politics. Thank goodness we're done with that, yes.
I read, I think this is correct, that Stanford welched and never paid Thomas Hill for the painting.
You might know better than I do. I have not ever looked into
I
that.
read that somewhere. First of all, he kept telling Thomas Hill, put this person in, take that person out. And so he just kept putting faces and taking out faces. But I think I'm correct, but I can't swear to it. I'll have to go back and look at it.
Again, I'm just delighted that we don't have deadbeat politicians doing stupid things anymore. Now, when the railroad is completed, thousands of Chinese were left jobless, but many Chinese stayed on working with the railroad, not only as cooks and things, but they built other railroads. This photo I like this photo because this photo is done when Southern Pacific was building the route over to Tehachapi called the Tehachapi Loop, and I grew up down there, so that's one of my favorite places. But this shows a white foreman and Chinese workers on a handcart down there. But the Chinese were neglected, kind of ignored, and kind of dismissed. But they still show up in popular culture once in a while. This is one of the more interesting things to me. This is a 1924 silent film directed by John Ford called The Iron Horse. And I've seen it. Not many people have, but I've seen it. And about 3 months ago, it actually showed up on Turner Classic Movies, so it has been restored. It's a melodrama. The guy with the hammer that's pointing at the rails, he's the son of the man who dreamed up the railroad, but his dad was killed, so the son makes it his mission to build the railroad. Yes?
Phil, quick question.
Yeah.
Didn't the the SP then pick up a lot of those Chinese and use them to go south through the valley and out to the,
And that's what the Tehachapi photo shows. They also built northward. And by the way, I'm so glad to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. But yes, the SP, which was still the CP, and they kept buying and consolidating, they used hundreds of those. They also built the railroad into the San Ramon Valley and down along into the Coast Range too. But they were used in many places, but the workloads were not nearly as heavy as the Transcontinental Railroad. So I'm going to get to this in a few slides, but Chinese ended up doing a lot of other things. But here's the Iron Horse. And this treats it somewhat fairly. It doesn't really focus on the Chinese work at all, but it has several important things that it shows. So here's one of the titles that begins the section over Donner Pass. There's no white labor, so it's necessary to bring in Chinese. And John Ford, bless his heart, was a wonderful filmmaker. And he apparently used some really elderly extras. Look at the upper left frame, who actually had worked on the railroad, according to some of the press accounts. That was an actual railroad worker. But he shot at Donner Pass. And I'm still trying to figure out how he cheated some of the angles. I think he used the Lincoln Highway route to do that. Also, in the lower left, that locomotive is the C.P. Huntington locomotive, which today is at the Railroad Museum. The Southern Pacific loaned that as a prop for the film, and it shows them pushing the locomotive on skids up to meet the roadbed. The film is remarkable in its technical detail. The story is really weird, but the film is remarkable. And then in 1939, you may know that Cecil B. DeMille made this huge overblown epic starring Joel McCrea called Union Pacific. I take that out because there's no Chinese in there, no mention of the Central Pacific at all. The next one I can find will really surprise you. It's Blazing Saddles. And of course, it doesn't really talk about the Chinese, but they have Chinese extras in there. And then, of course, just a few years ago, AMC TV and a company in Canada did a five-season series called Hell on Wheels, where they had a lot of in-depth information in the last 3 seasons focusing on the Chinese. It wasn't historically accurate, but it was respectful to culture. And they actually had Chinese historians consulting with them to make sure that the cultural aspects were correct. And they also had one really bad consultant. They asked me to consult on some of this. And somewhere in this photo, I'm an extra, because they flew me up to Canada, which was a lot of fun. But as we approached 2019, there was a lot of things, not only the Hell on Wheels TV show, but documentaries. These are 2 direct-to-video productions that I know the producers on. The Forest Service, oddly enough, did a wonderful 20-minute film that's on YouTube. It's called Legacy. And it's from a Forest Service perspective, but it's actually really a quite good video that talks about the importance of preserving these sites and the importance of understanding other cultures that were involved in them. But the railroad has a lasting significance, and I like to bring this up because this is kind of unknown, but it's a really great quote. At the ceremony on May 10th, after the track was completed, there was a big banquet in the fancy dining car for Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and all the big people. And then there was other banquets, and at the banquet for some of the common workers, including the Chinese team leaders, a guy named James Campbell, who this is the only reference I've ever seen of him, but he was the superintendent of rolling stock. He got up and he said, "Little you realize what you have done. You have this day changed the path of commerce and finance of the whole world. Where we now stand but a few months since could be seen nothing but the path of the red man or the track of the wild deer. Now 1,000 wheels revolve and will bear on their axles the wealth of half the world, drawn by the iron horse, darkening the landscape with his smoky breath and startling the wild Indian with its piercing scream. Philosophers would dream away a lifetime contemplating the scene, but the officers of the Pacific Railroad would look and exclaim, 'We are a great people and can accomplish great things.'"
All right.
Yeah, and I found that in the book, but I've never seen it anywhere else. And it just makes my spine just tingle. It really sums everything else up. But other things, yes, sir.
Sorry, not to interrupt you, but Campbell's name, I believe, is on the plaque on the ground of the tracks, along with Stanford and Charles Crocker. His name is there.
What plaque is that?
There was something on PBS not too long ago. They showed a picture of a not a very big plaque that's like on the ground, on the ties between the railroad, I guess, at the
That might be a promontory.
yeah, promontory, but I was interested from the Crocker's perspective, that it has Stanford, Huntington, Charles Crocker, not Edwin Bryant, and
Yeah.
it mentions Campbell. And then I think there was some strange reference, I think, to Mark Hopkins' wife, and her name was down as like part of the board of directors or something.
I'm gonna have to research that, thank you for giving me the idea, but I was just there last year, and I remember glancing at that, but I probably didn't read it in detail, but I made a photograph of it, so I'll take a look. But thank you. But yeah, I have not seen any other references of Campbell, but he was obviously a high-up executive in the railroad. But other things happened in the country in 1869. Just a few months later, the Suez Canal was complete. And this led Jules Verne to write a book you may have heard of called Around the World in 80 Days. And if you ever read that, he talks about going through the Suez Canal, but he talks about going on the Transcontinental Railroad. And so suddenly you're going at up to 40 miles an hour on the flat parts and 25 or 20 miles an hour over the Sierra, but it's a lightning speed. There were actually physicians that cautioned you from getting on trains because they thought if you went faster than 35 miles an hour, your guts would tear apart, your face would melt. I think of that as I drive Interstate 80 today. But the opening of the Suez Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad shrank our globe, and it made global trade and commerce really possible. For California, it allowed our agriculture to explode because suddenly we had a need and a desire and a monetary want to send fruit to places that were freezing in the winter. And we still do that. And that brings us to Sacramento, or Yifao, which is Second City. Sacramento had the second largest Chinatown in all of California, of course behind San Francisco. Anybody know what number 3 is? Marysville. Yes. And in Stockton, maybe number 4 or something. But this is from the Yifao Museum. This is called Sutter Slough, or Lake Sutter. It is now the Amtrak station. There are some shop buildings in this drawing that one of them still exists. This was Chinatown in the 1850s. This is Chinatown in 1960, and the red mark is about where Amtrak is today. Here's the Sacramento River. Here's the waterworks. It's now the City Museum. Here's where the Railroad Museum is today. So Sacramento had a huge Chinatown, and that's because Sacramento is like the hub of a wheel. When you get here from the Bay Area, you go north to Marysville in the Northern Mining District, you go east into Nevada City and Auburn and those places, you can go south into Placerville and in the increasingly important San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys for agriculture. So what else did the Chinese do? Here's this novelist, Heinrich Sienkowitz, who says, now let us look at the work the kind of work the Chinese perform. A single word describes it accurately. Everything. And this is what's been really collectively erased from a lot of our histories. So the Chinese, many of the Chinese who first worked on the railroad stayed in the Sierra and they cut cordwood, because not only do locomotives need wood for boilers, but every business everywhere that has a steam boiler needs to fuel it. And Sacramento had a lot of machine shops and foundries and things like that, as did the Bay Area, but everybody who needed heat had to do that. The Chinese were also heavily involved in hydraulic mining, which wasn't outlawed until 1874. And not only did they man the cannons and the water monitors and help pull gold out with the ripples, but they dug hundreds of miles of water ditches to supply the ponds for the headwaters. And many of these are still here. I used to work for the Forest Service. We had a document that documented a lot of these ditches on the Tahoe National Forest. There's over 300 miles of ditches. I have a feeling I'm going to be cut off very soon, so I'm going to quickly here. The Chinese also planted the first vineyards in Napa Valley, and they carved out the first caverns to store wine in. It's incredible. Of course, many people know about Locke and Walnut Grove, but Chinese planted and reclaimed a lot of the delta. They built levees to dry some of the land out. They planted the first orchards and row crops. And the town of Locke exists because they were thrown out of Walnut Grove. So I think it was Henry Locke, I might have his name wrong, donated land to lease to the Chinese. Georgetown, thank you, Mike. The Chinese were also heavily involved in the quarry business in Rockland and other places. And that's really important to me because my last job with State Parks is I literally worked in this building. And the first floor and the basement were largely built with granite from both Rockland and the prison quarry in Folsom, but mostly Rockland granite. And my friend Su Fong Chung, who was a retired professor at UNLV, wrote a book about Chinese in the woods. Chinese went into lumber and timber way into the Dakotas and Montana and all sorts of things to get away from some of the prejudice in California. But here's one of my favorite places. It was Chinese who developed commercial fishing on the coast. They were thrown out en masse in 1909, almost overnight, in Mendocino and Monterey and other places. And it's a shame because Of Mice and Men would have been quite a bit different book than the Chinese have been in there. The Chinese also got heavily involved in agriculture. This is a picture of Oxnard in the early 20th century. And I didn't learn this until a couple of years ago, but it was Chinese who built roads into Yosemite National Park. Yeah. Big Oak Flat Road is something they built. They built the road that goes into Wawona Grove. They actually built the Tioga Pass Road as a mining route, so it was important economically. And the National Park Service, bless their heart, a few years ago put in some exhibits spotlighting a lot of this Chinese history that I hope survives some of the nonsense going on today. But the Chinese were involved in everything. The railroad history is the most visible, but they were involved in agriculture, building, timber, stone, road construction, herbal medicine, fishing, culinary arts, art, and architecture. Yes?
Also, the mines in Tonopah, the silver mines.
Yes.
And the census, if you look the year like 1900 or whatever, it lists all the names of the Americans, their streets, their things. At the end, there's like 6 pages of Chinese names with no identity other than their name. So
Thank you.
no
I'm still
street number,
digging
no
into
numbers,
that.
No ages, no where they came from, but
Okay.
yeah, you can find it in the census.
And think of how remote Tonopah is. Oh my goodness. So on December 13th last year, the Secretary of Interior approved the designation of Chinese Camp National Historic Landmark, which is remarkable. It kind of came overnight. We had a hearing on the 12th, and the next day the Secretary approved it. It kind of gobsmacked us. The Summit Tunnel Complex was the largest of all of the Center Pacific workplaces because the work was so complex and it was there for so long. But because most visitors just focus on the railroad bed, the campsites are in pretty good shape, actually. UP doesn't really cooperate with us intimately because they're concerned about trespass and liability and things like that. And railroads are just evil by design. It just is the way it is. But since 2016, the 1882 Foundation has worked with the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and we've hired an archaeologist and a consultant to write the nomination. We've worked with a lot of archaeologists to do studies and things, looked up a lot of research information, and I've led a lot of tours up there, and we're still going to do them because now that it's a landmark, we've gotten a special use permit to do that. We're just in the final stages of getting that signed off. But Chinese Camp Landmark is the only national landmark that honors the workers who helped make the United States a transcontinental nation. It really connected the East and the West Coast together in a way that had never been imagined. And here's what it looks like again. This is the Union Pacific Tunnel easement. That's a little piece of private, that's a little piece of private, but all the green is national forest land. Here's Donner Pass Road, here's Rainbow Bridge, and a big parking area. So one segment is here around what's called McGlashan Point, which is a rocky knob, and the other section is down here. And both of them are part of what, I think it's a 42-acre, Ted? 26 acre, thank you, national landmark. We have a ceremony planned in August to dedicate that, where there will be one event in Sacramento at the new office that we're just about ready to lease, and another one up at the site itself on the next day. And so we'll publicize that as we get a little more detail. I mentioned the office. It's going to be in the Chinatown Mall, which is across I Street from the Amtrak station. And I don't have any current photos, so I found one for 1923. That's the Amtrak station. So stay tuned for that. If you can write really quickly, I can give you this stuff. The 1882 Foundation is 1882foundation.org. There is the Summit Tunnel Conservation Association. In 2021, the National Trust named our site one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in the United States. And then if you want to go look at the legacy video, it's I have a bit.ly link for it. If you do bit.ly/ all capital letters TNF legacy, it will take you to that video, which is, it's a nice video. January 22, Smithsonian published an article called "The Quest to Save California's Transcontinental Railroad Tunnels." And there is an Explore APA Heritage site where if you look at that, it gives you several sites in the mountains and part of western Nevada to go explore Asian Pacific heritage on that. And it's still daylight outside, so I haven't really overstayed my time very much. But I want to say thank you very much.